Hi, I am Mrs. Sloan, and today we're going to talk about the immune system. Now, this is underneath the Unit 4. Unit 4, if you recall, if you've been with me through the rest of this, you will recall Unit 4 is all about cell communication and the cell cycle. So we're going to talk about the immune system today as an example of how cells communicate with one another. Now, I want to remind you of the 4 big ideas you need to know for APBio: evolution, and we're going to touch on that, and how the immune system could have evolved, energetics, information storage and transmission, and system interactions. And I want you to know that in Unit 4, these are the big enduring understandings that are covered throughout Unit 4, and we are going to touch on those as well today, focusing again on our illustrative example of the immune response. Now, if you're new to me and my videos, down in the descriptor of this video, I have 2 column notes. Column 1 is a scaffolding of the notes I'm giving to my students, and I'll tell you how to fill those in, and I will reference them during our discussion. And then column 2 is empty. And if you see pictures that you find helpful, then you can throw them there into column 2 to help you when you're reviewing for your exam. All right. So first thing I want to touch on is how the immune response is an example of maintaining homeostasis and cell signaling. So if you look right here, your ability, or whether you're a fungi or you're a little protist or a human like us, you want to be able to sense your pathogen. Remember signal transduction, right? You have a receptor, then that information, signal transduction pathway from that receptor to a response. And so if there's a pathogen in your body, you want to be able to recognize that it is a foreigner, right? You want to recognize that this should not be in or on your organism. So you need to first be able to do that. And then you need to communicate that information to the cells that can respond and have an action to kill off that pathogen for you. And once you've killed off that pathogen, then you have that restoration of normal physiology. You're bringing yourself back into homeostasis. So remember, cell communication is a way to maintain your homeostasis in your body, to keep out those things that are foreign. So you want to think about, like, how could that have evolved? This is chapter 33 for my students, the lymphatic and immune system. So how did the immune system evolve? And then take a look at your notes real quick. You have this already in your notes. The immune system, remember, protects us from all sorts of harmful invaders, including bacterial and viral pathogens, various toxins, and even when our good cells go bad that we learned about in mitosis, right, in the cell cycling, how do we protect ourselves from ourselves when our own cells become cancerous? So let's look at the evolution of the immune system, and we can start with a really good example, and that would be in protists. Remember, protists are a eukaryotic cell, right, in that kingdom. And if times are good, they will be unicellular and work independently, like you're seeing in this. Oh, let me get a pointer real quick. Like you're seeing right here, they'll work all by their lonesome. But if they start to run low on food or nutrients, then they will group together and work together collectively. So on your notes, on immunity and cellular slime molds and protists, they can live independently when food is plentiful, but they live as a group, a big old multicellular slug, when food dwindles. Then they have some cells called sentinels, and that goes in your notes, some cells called sentinels that will circulate on the surface of this multicellular slug and patrol it for invading, let's say, fungi that are trying to steal their nutrients. And those sentinels would act like, in our immune system, we have macrophages that go and eat bad guys. And that's what those sentinels do. And they destroy them and end up sacrificing themselves in the process. So this is maybe the early evolution of our innate immune response. So they sacrifice themselves, precursors to our neutrophils and macrophages. And then moving on, we will upgrade here to fruit flies. And there are things called PAMPs and TLRs. Now, PAMPs are pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Remember the 4 important organic molecules, right? We know those: carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. Any of those could be a PAMP. And a PAMP is associated with a pathogen, a bad guy. So it could be the flagella, of some bacteria that is a PAMP. Okay, so PAMP is the bad guy, something on the bad guy, and then toll-like receptors. Remember, receptors are the beginning of a signal transduction pathway. The PAMP gets in the receptor, and they're called toll-like receptors. And this would trigger some sort of response. So you can see right here, TLRs in the plasma membrane, right, receptor of phagocytes. Those are things that do phagocytosis, attached to components commonly found on pathogens. Those are PAMPs. So these are examples of PAMPs, okay? Part of the membrane, a peptidoglycan, remember we learned about that. It could be DNA and RNA, could be double-stranded RNA that you would find in a virus, a fungal, or a parasite. And so there's a connection. And that's how you know bad guys are here. So here is a whole list of PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. You do not need to memorize these in any way. I just wanted to show you these are all things that could trigger that response, okay? Because you would have receptors for them, toll-like receptors. What are toll-like receptors? They're expressed on the surface of immune and non-immune cells. They recognize those structures expressed by those microorganisms. And here, again, is a whole list, just like before. I showed you here, I showed you a whole bunch of PAMPs. Here are a whole bunch of toll-like receptors. Again, you don't need to memorize them. I just want you to see that there are so many. And when the PAMP binds to one of these toll-like receptors, it leads to activation of the cell. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is get rid of the PAMP and anything that is associated with it. Okay, so here's some more receptors. Okay, now let's look at how this might play out very simply in a plant cell. Okay, you could have, look, here is your receptor, and here is a PAMP that would be on, let's say, sort of a bacterium, and it binds to it. Then this, so you have a receptor, signal transduction pathway, you end up producing or releasing or activating some antimicrobial compounds that will then attack and destroy this bacteria. Just like in your saliva right now, part of your innate immune response is you have antimicrobial agents in your saliva. So if you eat some food that has some bacteria in it, not only do you have the ability in your mouth to begin the digestion of carbohydrates with something called salivary amylase, but in there in your saliva are also these antimicrobial agents that could destroy a bacterium. All right, so when we talk about how it is in reality, just like I showed you all those PAMPs and all those toll-like receptors, this is cell signaling right here. And this doesn't even show you all the complexity of it. But I thought I would point out to you, do you see where it says TLR2, TLR, TLR4? These are all toll-like receptors that can recognize different PAMPs. So here you can see PAMPs and a TLR. And then you can see this would be your signal transduction pathway. Here it's impacting the DNA and what proteins are expressed and, what DNA is expressed as proteins that could then protect you, releasing chemicals that could protect and defend yourself against that pathogen. All right, so on your notes, I think I owe you underneath number 2, immunity in Drosophila fruit fly. You can recognize PAMPs, which are pathogen-associated molecular patterns, such as like double-stranded RNA, by viruses and other molecules found on bacteria or fungi. And then letter B, receptors for PAMPs have been found in plants and humans too, not just fruit flies, and maybe the earliest versions or receptors to recognize pathogens. And this could be an example of innate immunity. It's what you're born with. It's what you're born with is your innate immunity. And it can recognize common microbial invaders very quickly. The bummer with our innate immunity is it doesn't learn, okay? It doesn't learn. And they do not demonstrate an increased response on repeated exposure to the same pathogen. They do not demonstrate an increased response on repeated exposure to the same pathogen. Okay, now the next thing you have in your notes is the rise of adaptive immunity, having an immunological memory. So remember, I'm showing you the evolution. So your innate immunity is quick, it's fast, it responds to that problem, but you know what? It doesn't learn. same problem could walk in a week later and we're like, oh my gosh, look at this. And we respond to that same problem. Your adaptive immunity helps you learn, respond more quickly, and take it out permanently, hopefully, right? That's the idea behind vaccines. Let me give you an example here. Okay, so innate versus adaptive immune players. You are going to learn about these, so don't stress out. I will teach you these. Today, in this video, we're going to focus on innate immunity right here. And in video 2, I'm going to talk to you about adaptive immunity. So your innate immunity, the way, let me explain it kind of in a summary. Your innate immunity would be what I would call policemen. Okay, so policemen are effective if there's somebody's robbing somebody or there's bad guys around, the police are going to respond and take care of it. And I support police. But what I would say the adaptive immunity is like, these are like Navy SEALs. These are special forces, and they have been highly trained against invaders. So we're going to learn about this, like I said, in video 2, but let me give you another example to help you see the difference between these two. If you had never been vaccinated against polio and you were exposed to polio, your innate immunity would see that it's foreign. It would try to kill it off. It would be somewhat successful, but you could end up getting polio. And as a result of that, you could lose the ability to move your right leg, let's say. Okay. But then you would develop an immunity over time and you would be protected. Nobody wants to lose their right leg. That's why you get vaccinated, lose the ability to move it. That's why you get vaccinated against polio, because what happens is you'll expose your body to a weakened version of polio. It won't give you, it doesn't have the ability metabolically to destroy your cells, but it can still trigger a response in your body where it will raise special forces, your adaptive immunity, raise that army up. It'll attack this invader, destroy it, and take it out. And once it's done doing that, it's raised this clone army. It has almost all of the clone army commit suicide because you can't maintain that level of an army within for every illness or disease you have. But then if you ever experienced polio a second time where you were exposed to it, let's say for real, you were traveling and you were exposed to it, you have memory cells that can respond rapidly against it and take it out, similar in speed to your innate response. But these special forces can take out the ones that are invaded your own body cells, and these special forces can also take out the ones that are, let's say, in your plasma or in your lymph. So I know that's a lot, and we'll get into the details of it, but what you need to know is we really need our adaptive immunity. Okay, we really need our adaptive immunity to kick in against some of these pathogens, because they, quite frankly, could kill you if you don't have that immunity. So on the rise of the adaptive immunity, having an immunological memory, like, oh, I recognize this pathogen. So the description is you have diverse receptors on the surfaces of specialized B and T cells, and I'll be teaching you about B and T cells, that bind to antigens similar to PAMPs. An antigen is a specific region of the PAMP that stimulates a cascade of cells responding to that specific antigens. It's increased responses upon second exposure. These antigen receptors are incredibly diverse due to gene rearrangement. So that is when you can think about how our information is passed on is in our genes, right? And those genes, we arrange them in different ways. We'll talk about that through gene expression in a later chapter. And it allows for continual evolution of responses to an ever-changing myriad of pathogens. So think about it. We need to respond to the environment around us, and pathogens are going to be new that come. Think about COVID. That's new, right? And so when we need to be able to respond to our ever-changing environment in order to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so that is an overview of the chapter. I know that's a lot, but you're going to be awesome. I'm sure I'm going to guide you. So remember, this video, we're just going to focus on the police. We're going to focus on our innate immunity, our rapid response. So the first thing we need to know is, where are these guys hanging out? So you have your circulatory system, which is your blood, right? And you need to remember you have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. The smallest of all your blood vessels are capillaries, and that's where all exchange takes place of nutrients and wastes and oxygen and CO2. But at the arterial end of the capillaries, you have something called hydrostatic pressure, which is the force on the blood due to your heart pumping. And at the arterial end of the capillary, it tends to push fluids out. By the time you get to the venule end of the capillary, that blood, that hydrostatic, the force on the blood due to the heart tends to be less, and the osmotic pressure drawing things in is greater, and so it recovers. But here's the deal. More fluid is pushed out at the arterial end than is recovered at the venule end. So you could have an increase of fluid around the capillaries. So what picks up that extra tissue fluid? Well, your lymph does. So your lymph picks it up and it will return it to your circulatory system below your clavicle right here. You have some subclavian veins, and that fluid is returned to your circulatory system. So your lymphatic system and your circulatory system are in close association with each other. Within your lymphatic system, you've probably heard of lymph nodes. Like if you're sick and your doctor feels, or you feel right here and you can feel they're swollen, that means you probably have an infection that you're dealing with, okay? So on your notes, you have basics. So let's talk about what your lymphatic system does. And let's move me, okay? Let me go right up here. So the basics on this, the functions of the lymphatic system, the first one, what I just told you about, is it needs to absorb that excess tissue fluid, okay? So on your notes, collects excess tissue fluid at the capillaries. A second function is that it absorbs fat at the intestines. So, this is number 3 on your notes. I have these a little bit out of order. So number 3 on your notes, collects fat at the villi of the small intestines. Now, this is weird, right? Because you don't think, it's like, okay, you were talking about the immune system and now all of a sudden you're talking about fats. This is one that people forget all the time, but I'm going to show you pictures later, little microvilli in your intestines. And this is where you absorb that fat out of your food. And so they help with that, and it moves through the lacteals. Put a pin in that. We won't worry about that. Number 2 is it produces lymphocytes. So protects the body by producing lymphocytes. So it absorbs excess tissue fluid. It produces lymphocytes. Lymphocytes just means white blood cells, and a special type of white blood cells, which would be your B and T cells. All right. And then they absorb fat at the intestines. Now, a problem, if you don't absorb that excess tissue fluid, you could get swelling. And that swelling is called an edema when you have excess tissue fluid. As you can see, this person doesn't really have an ankle. All right. So as I said before, the lymphatic system and the circulatory system are in close association with each other, close association with the cardiovascular system. Just like you have cardiovascular capillaries, in your lymphatic system, you have lymph capillaries and you have lymph veins. So you have lymphatic capillaries that go to venules, to lymph veins with valves, and then it gets dumped off at the subclavian vein right here to get that tissue fluid back into your circulatory system. Now take a look at this individual right here. So they have different nodes throughout their body. So you have lymph nodes here in your throat. You have some in your arm that you can check to see if there's an infection in your groin region. You also have lymph nodes that you can access. So they have valves in your lymphatic system and move similarly to your circulatory system in your veins, because in arteries by definition carries blood away from your heart and veins carry it back towards your heart. So what keeps the blood flowing in the arteries is the contraction of your heart. So how do you get blood back? Let's say from your big toe. Well, your skeletal muscles, when they contract, they kind of smish the blood vessels, or lymphatic vessels in this case, kind of like if you grabbed a tube of toothpaste and it had the lid off, it would just squirt all over the place. Your muscles push against the walls of your lymphatic vessels, and because there are valves, blood can only flow in one direction. So that's a main mover of the fluid throughout your lymphatic system. So movement dependent upon skeletal muscle contractions. And once the tissue fluid enters the lymphatic vessels, then it's called lymph. Okay, so It was blood it was the fluid portion of the blood, the plasma, and fluid got pushed out, and now it's tissue fluid when it's around it, but once it then goes into your lymphatic system, it's called lymph. So next, oh, I haven't yet. This is a problem. I just thought you would like this other picture of edema. So in this case, this is, huge swelling, and keep in mind, it's not like they can just drain this. There's like extra fluid around every single cell. And it could be that lymph ducts, when coming up from the leg for this individual, are blocked. There are cases sometimes where people have worms in those lymph ducts. So the fluid is there, but it can't get back and have access all the way back up via your subclavian vein to return to your circulatory system. Yeah, that's a great picture. All right. Next, let's look at the organs of the lymphatic system. So you have 4 main, okay? So you've got your bone marrow, okay? And in your bone marrow, this produces all your blood cells. I'll show you some pictures of that in just a minute. You've got your thymus gland, you've got a spleen, and you've got lymph nodes. So notice the reason why they have little eviscerated girl here is because the thymus gland is larger in children when you are learning foreign from self. And so as you age, the thymus gland gets smaller and smaller. So that's why they have a little person here to show you that. So there's your thymus gland. Not to be confused with your thyroid gland or parathyroid gland in your neck. It's really kind of above your heart, as you can see right here, the thymus gland. Okay, spleen and lymph nodes. So let's go through them all underneath organs. The 2 primary ones are your red bone marrow. Okay, now what comes from your red bone marrow? All your blood cells, okay? Not just your immune cells, but all your blood cells come from there. Your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. And then you'll have a group of these white blood cells, which are going to specifically be those special forces I told you about, those lymphocytes. So red bone marrow, all blood cells originate from this tissue, including your B and T lymphocytes, okay? But the B cells, it's one of your groups of special forces, your B cells mature in the bone marrow. So that's why they're called B cells. So B cells mature here in the bone marrow. And I'm sure you've heard of antibodies before, right? It's the B cells that make antibodies. We'll be talking about that in video 2. All right, and then here, this is a thymus gland, and here you can see it here as well. And I told you it gets smaller as you age. The thymus gland, this is where the T cells mature. This is your special forces that do cell-to-cell combat. They literally fight directly with a foreign cell or your own, primarily your own body cells that have become infected with that foreign cell. And again, that's video 2. So all blood cells come from your bone marrow, but the special forces B cells mature in the bone marrow, and special forces T cells, they will migrate to the thymus gland and mature there. All right. Secondary organs of your immune response is the spleen. I got this picture of spleen, not to gross you out, but from a cooking website. I personally don't eat spleen, but apparently people do. So this is what your spleen looks like. And whereas lymph nodes filter your tissue fluid, the spleen's job is to filter your blood and to check it for any pathogens. So your lymph node cleans your tissue fluid, but your spleen is checking and monitoring your blood. So underneath spleen, put filters blood. And then for lymph nodes, which would be these purple, dark purple dots right here, okay, that the lymph node, put filters tissue fluid, filters your tissue fluid. All right. And this is where your special forces guys hang out. They hang out here in the lymph nodes. All right. Now, there are patches of lymphoid tissue scattered throughout your body. One of those patches can be found in the back of your throat, and those are your tonsils. So tonsils trap germs in the throat. Then you have other areas as well called Peyer's patches in your intestines. And right, and remember I told you this is where fat is absorbed. So you've got a couple things going on here in your intestines. You're absorbing fat using your lymphatic system, but you also have, they are there to monitor if there's any microbial agents right there in your intestines as well as your your appendix. So Peyer's patches are in intestinal walls, and the vermiform appendix attached to the cecum. So your appendix, that's where they are also located. All right, and you have that in your notes. Okay, so let's talk about what we've done so far, all right? We talked about the evolution of the immune system. We started talking about PAMPs and TLRs. We looked at that in protists and flies and us. We talked about the evolution of the adaptive immune response, the learning, which will be video 2. And we looked at the parts of your body, the organs in your body, and what they have to do with your immune response. And we learned that all the blood cells, right, come from your bone marrow, but the special forces ones, B cells mature in their bone marrow, and T cells mature in your thymus gland. And then we learned about the 4 important organs of your immune response. The 2 primary ones, remember, are your red bone marrow and your thymus gland, and your secondary ones, your spleen, and then your lymph nodes. So now what I want to focus on in this latter half of this video is your innate immune response, what we're all born with as babies, okay? What we come out of the womb having the ability and how we defend ourselves. So to start with that, we need to think about what do we have to protect ourselves before we even involve the police, right? So how do we keep like locks and doors that you keep invaders out of your home, right? For us, that would be our skin, right? That keeps things out. So that's where we want to start, okay, is with our skin that protects us. And then any secretions or glands associated with the skin that could also help protect us. So on barriers to entry, so you don't even get those invaders within our body, is skin and hair. You have oil glands that inhibit growth of bacteria, You have little ciliated cells in the trachea that help get bacteria up and out, that line your respiratory tract. In your stomach, you have a very low pH in your stomach to help kill off invaders with its low pH. You have lysozyme, an antimicrobial agent that breaks down bacterial cell walls. It's found in your saliva. You have mucus secretions and hair in your nose. So all of these things are working, we're working to keep things out of your body. Because if you think about it, right, when you eat food, you're introducing things to your digestive tract where things could then invade. When you breathe, you could breathe in pathogens like COVID, right? You could breathe it in. And so we have areas to defend all those different tracts in our body where we can invite things to come in, right? So also we have harmless bacteria that we're in a symbiotic relationship with that will live in things like our vaginal tract or our intestines. And what they're doing is they're taking up space so that bad guys cannot find a home. They don't have any room to set up camp. That's why after you have taken antibiotics, because you have a bad bacteria in you, antibiotics not only kill the bad bacteria in your body, but they'll kill good bacteria too. So you need to reintroduce, using things like yogurt and things like that, the good bacteria into your body so they can take up residence so that the bad bacteria don't have access to that space, all right? So then let's say they get through. You have a cut and they get through your skin. They survive the low pH of your stomach and get through the walls of your digestive system. How do we protect ourselves? Well, first thing you need to know is good cells from bad. You need to know your self cells, that belong to you versus an invading cell. So how do we know who the invaders are? Well, remember we talked about PAMPs before, right? So these are conserved proteins or carbohydrates of invading, of pathogens. And the specific area of it that triggers an immune response is called an antigens. So there are antigens that are specific to bacteria. There are antigens that are specific to viruses. Now, let me make a note of that. Let's say one of my students needed a kidney and I was a perfect match. If my kidney was given to them, as far as they're concerned, they would say, wait a minute, remember when we talked about the functions of proteins in our cell membranes? Remember channels, carriers, and then what? Cell recognition, right? My cells in their body would trigger an immune response because they would say, who's Winnie Sloan? I'm going to need to attack it and destroy it. So my own cells, given in love to one of my students, their own immune system would attack it because it would interpret that as something foreign and an antigen that they needed to destroy. So, on your, let's see, we'll talk about antigens. I'm trying to think about, I don't have it quite yet on your notes, but I wanted you to see it. So what do you do when you, to recognize and destroy those antigens? You need to call the good guys in to the rescue. So here are the two categories. I've introduced this a little bit before. Here's your innate immunity, and here's your adaptive immunity. And there's a little bit of overlap there, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So the players that you have, when you see things like, and we'll put these in the notes, but I want you to see this guy right here is a macrophage. What do you hear in that? Phagocytosis. So his job is to eat. If you're foreign and he has a receptor and it says, wait, you don't belong here, then he will eat and destroy you. Natural killer cells, what do you think they're going to do? They kill. Neutrophils, of all of your policemen, neutrophils are the most prominent. That's the one you have the most of. These right here, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, now all of these guys would be called white blood cells, right? And so these white blood cells are all defending you, and they can defend in different ways. They can release chemical signals to trigger an immune response. They can kill. They can release other signals that cause inflammation. This is all part of your innate response. Now, here you can see a group of them, these basophils, the eosinophils, and the neutrophils. Do you see how it looks like they're very granule in here? They've got all those little dots in there and some weird nuclei, right? These are all considered granulocytes. We're going to learn about complement proteins later that are released, let's say, from your liver, and they have to be activated, and then they start having a response, and we'll talk about some of their responses later. Killer cells kill, macrophages eat. Dendritic cells, if you've heard of detritus, that's like dead things. If you have a cellular immune battle, a little war, those dendritic cells are going to eat up all that cellular waste. If you have destroyed cells, they're going to eat up that cellular waste. And not only that, they will carry around anything that they kill. It's kind of like if you were in war, and I know this sounds gross, but if there was a battle and you won and you cut the head off whoever you beat and you carried it around, that's what dendritic cells do and macrophage cells do. They are called presentation cells, and they'll be like, hey, anybody recognize any more of these bad guys? Look what I found. And they just carry around that antigen associated molecule so they can kind of warn the rest of the body and actually induce the adaptive immune response. And we'll learn about that later. Mast cells release histamine, which also contributes to your inflammatory response. So on your notes, where it says inflammatory reaction, this is a result of damaged tissues due to injury or invaders. So here you can see some inflammation. They've got some sort of infection in their foot. This person has a cut that was not well taken care of. Looks like they stitched it themselves. You can see swelling and redness. This person has a sty in their eye. These are all examples of your policemen, your special forces, trying to defend and protect your body. And part of that is the swelling response. Now, this is no dig against policemen, so please do not interpret it as such. But if they see like a bunch of bad guys over there, sometimes they will launch chemical bombs and they'll just destroy everybody, good guys and bad guys alike, just to wipe out the bad guys. If you've had a sore throat, these are damaged throat cells. This is because bombs are getting thrown in your throat to try to destroy the bad guy, but it also destroys your own body cells in the process and in their attempt to defend you. And that's why your throat becomes sore. Okay, these are all examples of inflammation. So who are some of the players in this process? So one player are the granulocytes. And if you remember the granulocytes, those are the ones that were the eosinophils and the basophils and the neutrophils. So they have the little granules in them. And so one of those is the neutrophils, and those are most numerous, and they are first on the scene. So granulocytes often take the first stand during the infection. They attack any invaders in large numbers. They eat until they die. If you've had had pus in an infection, those are dead white blood cells. Some of them are even specialized, eosinophils is their name, and they will attack things like if a worm got in your body. All right. And then macrophages, these are big eaters. But the thing is, they get into the site of the infection by being a little bit smaller. They're called monocytes. And that's how they can get in. And then they grow into these giant macrophages, and they will stay in that one place and eat until they kill themselves from eating and consuming and destroying all that bacteria. They can also send out warning signals to alert the rest of your body. So they play a key part. So let's see. Go to B, underneath the possible fighters, monocytes, which migrate to the infection scene, and then they become macrophages, even bigger eaters, alarms and scavengers. And then you have dendritic cells. So dendritic cells are an eater, and they devour intruders, like I said, but they also will help activate the rest of your immune system, and they'll clear of like the destruction of having this immunological war in your body. And then another possible fighter is a natural killer cell. And I'm going to show you a picture of him in just a minute. I want to show you a little bit about the inflammatory response first. So natural killer cells, if you want to put it in your notes for right now, recognize and remove disease cells containing viruses or cancer cells. So what the natural killer cell is doing is they are taking your own body cells that are infected by that pathogen and killing those cells off. All right. So let's take a look at some players. Let's say you fall and you skin your knee. So here's a bunch of bacteria in at your wound site. All right. So blood platelets are going to come, right? And they're going to try to stop the bleeding, right? That's what platelets will do. Mast cells right here are releasing a chemical signal. They're talking by releasing a chemical signal called histamine that's going to cause these blood vessels to become leaky. And let me show you a picture of that. Okay, I think one more here. Here we go. So if you look, here is a capillary cell wall. And normally, remember I talked to you about the arterial versus the hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end, right? Forcing fluids out. Well, normally just little fluids can get out because there's very little space between these endothelial cells of your capillaries. But when histamine is present, the space becomes larger right here between them. And as a result of that, then the cells can get out, like those monocytes can get out and squeeze in between your endothelium cells much easier to get out there and start fighting. Okay, so mast cells release histamine that allow these like neutrophils to squeeze out here. Remember, I told you neutrophils are most prolific, and they will be releasing cytokines and chemical signals to trigger other invaders to come, and they will start engulfing and fighting. Here's a macrophage. Remember, at first he was a monocyte. To get out, he was smaller, and then he becomes this big engulfing. And again, he's releasing chemical signals. It is like pulling a fire alarm is what they're doing with these cytokines and saying, oh my gosh, we have an infection. We need more help here. And they increase the whole heat of that area and cause this area to be swollen and inflamed. So symptoms and causes, you will get swelling because mast cells release histamines, okay? histamines, which causes vasodilation. Now, some of you that have allergies, so an allergy is an immune response to something that really shouldn't, it won't hurt you. What hurts you is your allergic reaction to it. If you're allergic to peanuts or bee stings, that's your immune system overreacting to what it considers to be a PAMP, an antigen, when it really doesn't need to do that. So when you are having an allergy attack, you will take what? Antihistamines, because it's this swelling that causes the headaches and the nose to run. And that swelling can also be so bad, it could send you into shock. And we'll talk about that at the end of this once we learn about your specific immune, your adaptive immunity. Okay, so swelling, you can get underneath symptoms and causes. You can get redness, higher temperatures due to enlarged capillaries. You can get pain because of the swelling, then it can make it tender. And and the swollen area triggering free nerve endings. So what does this result in? It results in a fever, which could inhibit the growth of the microorganisms, and it could be a localized fever. Like if you have an infected cut, it might be swollen just right there and just warm right there in order to, it's raising the temperature to try to kill off that microorganism. You can get pus from dead white blood cells, from dead phagocytic white blood cells, and you can get these leaky dilated capillaries, right, that are enabling it so you can get more of those cells there and out to the area to defend it. So leaky dilated capillaries allows fighting cells, dendrites, neutrophils, and other white blood cells more easily access the injury site, Okay, and then here are the natural killer cells. I wanted to show you, this is a natural killer cell right here. This could be one of your own body cells that is infected by a virus. And so it just literally docks right up to it and causes death. It's like it's throwing a bomb in there inside the target cell. So it kills it off, because if it's containing more viruses, it could release those viruses out to the rest of your body and make the infection worse. So natural killer cells can destroy your own body cells. So, and you have that back on number 2D. Okay, the last thing for this video, I hope you're hanging in there, is going to be, this is in your book, and it kind of takes you through the steps of it, 1, 2, 3, and 4, so you can use your book to review that. Is I want to talk about protective proteins. And this is just another example of why we talk about the immune system underneath cell communication. So there's two kind of categories of protective proteins I want to focus on right now, and that's the complement system and cytokines. And in a nutshell, real quick before we start, is the complement system, these are proteins circulating throughout your body, made by your liver, that, for example, or primarily, that need to be activated by an invader, and your response to that invader, and then they're like, the light is green, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the ways they defend and protect your body. Cytokines, right? Cyte means cell, right? Remember cytokinesis and mitosis? Cyte means cell. These are chemicals that cells can release to communicate with other cells during an infection, all right? So let's start with the complement proteins. And it's called complement because they're complementing the rest of the immune response. And the complement proteins are a part of both your innate and your adaptive immunity. So they probably started off just working for your innate immune response, and then evolution of the adaptive immune response, they became a part of that as well. And they basically have 3 ways to help destroy a pathogen. One is they can cause cells, invading cells. These proteins literally build a little scaffolding into the cell membranes and cell walls and pierce the cells so that fluids can move in, and then the cell will just swell, because, right, it doesn't have the integrity of the cell membrane anymore, and they'll just swell and burst. That is one way. So on your notes, let me get you caught up here. So underneath protective proteins, you have complement proteins, are produced mainly by the liver, and they complement certain immune responses. They're always in the blood, but they need to be activated by a pathogen. So one of the things they can do is they can cause enhanced inflammation. Enhanced inflammation trigger histamine released by, remember when I talked to you about the mast cells releasing histamine? So they can increase the whole inflammatory response. Number 2, they can increase phagocytosis. So they can tag bacteria, or they can respond to, let's say, bacteria that have been tagged by antibodies, and antibodies are part of your adaptive immune response. Either way, they will increase phagocytosis. So that is letter B, increase phagocytosis to bind to the surface of a pathogen to increase the odds that it will get eaten, either in response to antibodies or just tagging bacteria itself. And C, membrane attack complexes, which is what we have right here. They produce holes in the surface of some bacteria and viruses so they can burst and destroy the integrity of that cell. All right. So here you can see complement proteins are drilling. You can see right here, and it is a very, very complex. It's like this triggers this, triggers this, triggers this, triggers this. I mean, it is so, remember when I talked to you about the beginning about the complexity and the intracellular signaling? So complex because you don't want to do this accidentally to your own cells, right? But you will build these, drill into these bacterial cells, and then fluids will enter, and then it causes it to burst. So that would be an example of 3C, membrane attack complexes. All right. Now, cytokines. Cytokines are released by cells, and there's two things they will do. One, they can give a signal, hey, I'm infected. I'm going to die here, but protect yourself. Okay. And then that's interferon. And then interleukins are another type of cytokines. And mind you, there's lots of cytokines. Interleukins are like, yes, let's fight. And those are the things that are released by those dendritic cells and the macrophages, which is basically giving Red Bull to all the fighting cells. And now they're even more amped and they want to fight even more. Those are interleukins, like fight on. So here, you can see on your protective proteins, on your complement system, it says cytokines are soluble proteins that affect the behavior of other cells. So there's something released by cells and they affect the behavior of other cells. So interferons are a type of cytokine that is produced by virus-infected cells. So here you can see this virus is inside this cell. And so this cell is releasing an alarm saying, hey, I'm infected. And what basically this interferon will do is it'll be a signal to other neighboring cells to slow down their metabolism so they don't accidentally produce more viruses. Okay, so interferon is a type of cytokine that is produced by virus-infected cells. It's a warning received by receptors that causes neighboring cells to produce substances that slow their cellular metabolism down, that interfere with viral replication. And then the other ones, like I said, interleukins are like, yay, let's go, let's fight more. And this is part of that whole adaptive immunity. So I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. All right. So part of both your innate and your adaptive immunity. Okay, good job, kids. I'm proud of you. I know this was a long presentation, but that is going to be it for, and look, I can't move myself. Okay, great. That is it. We've talked about the police, and next time I will talk to you about the special forces and the adaptive immunity. All right, so let me see if I can stop this. All right, just a little bit slow. Okay, have a good day.